Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for attending session 2 of this year's Sheep Breeders Roundtable. The second time this event has been online, and hopefully we'll won't have any too many technical issues, and we'll get through this without any major catastrophes. My name's Mike Coffey, and I'm based in Edinburgh, looking after the SRUC Animal Breeding and Genomics team. And I also undertake the, run the unit eGenes that undertakes the national genetic and genomic evaluations, hopefully soon for sheep as well. I'm joined here with Sam. Introduce yourself, Sam.
Very good evening, Sam Boon, Manager of Signet Breeding Services.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you. Right, well, we've got a little bit of housekeeping if we go to the next slide. So we're going to go through this one talk at a time. We've got 3 talks, and at the end of each talk there'll be the opportunities to ask any sort of burning questions that are of immediate relevance. But if you want to ask questions as we go along, we'll have a session right at the end to answer the questions. It's possible that more than one person will ask a similar question, and they'll be grouped and then asked as a single question. This is how you do it. On your screen, you've got your control panel. On my screen, it's top left, but it looks a bit like this here. And you click on the white arrow to open the questions box. You see it there? Oh, sorry, that's my screen. That's my screen. You can't see it, obviously, but there's a thing there with questions. You click on that, and you type your question there. And then when you're done with your question, you have to press send, that thing on the right-hand side. And then those questions will all come up on the screen here. Emma will be monitoring them, looking after them. And as I say, at the end, we'll be able to ask. It may well be that we have a popular question that goes to the top of the list, the most popular question, or whatever it is. So anyway, thank you very much, everybody, again. And with no further ado, we'll carry on. I don't know why people say that. I have no idea what it means. I think it just means let's move on. And our first speaker tonight is Sam Boon, who, as he said, looks after Signet for us. And he's going to be talking about multi-breed evaluations for maternal sheep breeds. Over to you, Sam.
Thank you, Mike, for that introduction. And yes, indeed. So I'm Signet Manager, and Signet very much part of AHDB's Breeding and Genetic Evaluation Service. Next slide, please. So we provide the genetic evaluations for sheep and beef producers, and it's all about helping the industry to capitalise on genetic improvement. So Signet sort of sits between AHDB's research team that helps to develop and fund some of the new genetic tools, and AHDB's knowledge exchange team that are out there helping commercial farmers to use the information that's produced in pedigree flocks and herds to capitalise on genetics. And with support from QMS and HCC, we're operating in England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Next slide, please. So it's useful just to very quickly look back on exactly how far we've come. From the early days of MLC recording schemes, we've actually got 50 years worth of performance recording under our belts, and we can see some of the big breakthroughs when we developed BLUP analysis, new approaches to the statistics, and really the big leaps forward when we started working together, doing a cross-flock breeding evaluations and working with breeding groups. This is a slide from the Centurion Pole Dorset breeding group, but it could actually be any of the breeds that we work with. And actually in this morning's session, you heard David Roster talking a little bit about a breeder example from that. Next slide, please. Before I get into the main bit of my talk, just to say it's been a busy year for Signet. Amongst other things, we've brought online some new ultrasound scanning equipment, which is EID compatible, so that's been quite exciting. RAM Compare Year 5 results are out. There's quite a nice YouTube clip talking about the results of that project, and Year 6 RAMs are in already with 4 new farms joining us. We've conducted the sheep breeds survey, and again, the results of that are both available online, and there's quite a nice YouTube presentation. There's been a tremendous amount of media interest around those results and the changing nature of the sheep industry. The CT scanner's back on the road, and George is going to talk to you about the sort of a one-off project that we did, breeding for worm resistance, which, like all good one-off projects, we're about to do for a second year. Next slide, please. most of the information that we produce is now available online, and in a year when staff haven't been in the office and it's been harder to print and post things out, I'm very grateful that all of our reporting services are available to clients online. Commercial farmers can use things like Flock Finder in the sheep for sale section to find animals and flocks that are involved in performance recording. We've developed new flock book services with a couple of the breed societies as a bit of a pilot on how we can work together. There's greater compatibility between the farm software providers and ourselves, and we've got some great inbreeding software that's getting used a tremendous amount at the moment. So lots of really useful tools that are available online. Next slide, please. It was about 8 years ago that we talked at Sheep Breeders Roundtable about the potential of moving our terminal sire evaluations from being individual separate breed evaluations to a mixed breed approach. It doesn't actually seem that long ago. Sheep Breeders Roundtable was the catalyst for that work, and in 2018 we went on to develop it. And in 2 years later, with support from HCC, we developed a mixed breed hill sheep evaluation that you're going to hear a bit more about tomorrow night. So that enables us to do evaluations on a monthly basis, to introduce data from crossbreds and commercial data from projects like Ram Compare. It makes breed comparison easier where animals are reared under the same environment, and it makes us a lot easier to move new research out into the industry. Rather than changing 9 different evaluations, we chat to Mike and we do it once, and we have that new breeding value. So the missing bit of the jigsaw was very much our lowland maternal breeds, which is where we're going to go next. So next slide, please. So our maternal evaluations we're planning to launch in a couple of months' time. These are all the breeding values that those with Clin, Wilt, Shahorns, Exlana, Romney, Jacob, Blueface Leicester, Rusan, and a few others will have at their disposal. If you click the next slide, Carrie-Anne, we can see this, the ones in green are traits that we had in the past, but maybe only for 1 or even 2 breeds. They're now going to be available for everybody. And the ones that are in blue are traits that, as part of a CL-funded project, we've managed to produce for the first time, that are going to be some new traits within our evaluations. So maternal breeding programs are a lot more complicated than that of terminal sires, and by their very nature, there's a lot more traits, and we're going to have a big expansion in traits next year. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the changes. The first one is the way that we analyze muscle and fat depth. And you may have heard me talk about this before because we've made these changes to our terminal sire and our hill sheep evaluations. And it means that rather than adjusting these traits for the age of the animal, we're going to adjust them for the weight of the animal. That means that we can select for muscle yield independently of growth rate. It means that we can, in theory, increase yield without increasing mature size. And particularly in maternal breeds and hill breeds, it can be a real advantage to increase yield without making adult mature size greater. Because at a fixed weight, as muscling goes up, the animals will tend to get leaner if you hold weight exactly the same. It does mean we're having to change the weightings that we place in the indexes on fat depth in order to maintain the status quo. And I think the indirect advantage of that is probably that it's going to improve body condition score at the same time. So quite an important change, and actually one that's gone really well in our other breeding programs. Next slide, please. This is just a very quick chart that shows you what I'm talking about. We have scan weight along the bottom axes, muscle depth along the side axes, and the little box at the top is showing animals really good muscle depth relative to their size. So that's just a representation of what we're doing. And interestingly, Signet clients can produce these charts for themselves as part of one of our new reports that are available. So you can go onto the website and create this sort of chart if you want to have a look at your own data. Next slide, please. So one of the big changes is the introduction of new breeding values for ewe mature size and body condition score. So ewe mature size is important because we know that as we select for increasing lamb growth rates, the ewes are going to get bigger. And the downside of that is it tends to have a negative impact on flock efficiency, both in economic terms and also in environmental terms. If we've got two sheep of very different weights that can produce the same weight of lamb, then ideally that animal with slightly smaller overall mature size is going to tend to be more efficient. So there's a few areas that AHDB are involved with here. There's a really good abacus report that's online looking at optimizing mature size of both cows and ewes in the national flock. Emma Much up at SIUC's doing some great work with her PhD looking at growth curves. But the one that's going to have the immediate impact on you is the new breeding values that are being developed within both our maternal and our hill sheep breeding evaluations. Next slide, please. So in terms of ewe weights, basically you can weigh them at any points that are suiting you and collect that data on your farm software. All the weights come through to us. In terms of analysis, we then drop the weights into 3 specific windows. So there's one that's pre-mating, sort of 140 to 175 days prior to lambing, so that's the pre-mating weight. And then we've noticed 2 spikes in weighing events from the farm data that we've got. One, when lambs would be about 8 weeks of age, when I can imagine breeders are sending the ewes over the scales at exactly the same time. And then a second spike a little bit later than that, where I suspect many flocks are doing a sort of a true weaning weight. They're sorting out the flock, and again, everything's going over the scales. So we've got sort of 2 spikes post-lambing. We analyze ewe body condition score in exactly the same way, with the weights being allocated on those date ranges. So actually in the background, we're producing 6 breeding values, 3 for ewe weight, 3 for body condition score, with relationships fitted between them. But the intention, certainly at the moment, is just to publish 2. Those are the weights around pre-mating time for both ewe mature weight and body condition score. Next slide, please. And we've got a tremendous amount of data. We're talking 100,000 ewe weights came in many cases, ewes being measured many times, which gave us great repeatability, really good heritabilities, as you'd probably guess for a growth trait. And hence, we've already got really high accuracy values within our breeding evaluation where these animals are being measured. So this chart here is just one showing clean stock grams. You've got accuracy along the y-axis, and you can see that most of the stock grams in the last 10 years already have really good accuracy. So that's fantastic. Next slide, please. And if you just click on the next 2 animations, Carrie-Anne, you can see here that we've got 8-week weight plotted along the bottom and ewe mature weight plotted along the y-axis for a number of clean stock grams. We can see in red those animals that actually have the genetics for quite high ewe mature size, but aren't outstanding for early lamb growth rate, and those in green that have really good genetics for fast lamb growth rate, but a much more moderate ewe mature size. So there's a difference there that we can exploit, but we can only exploit it if we're measuring those animals at both points during their lifetime. So a real opportunity to try and bend the curve somewhat to find fast early growth rates that don't result in absolutely massive ewe mature size. Next slide, please. The other new breeding values that we're developing are based on abattoir data. So here we're using RAM Compare project, and we've got a series of parameters that have been worked out there looking at the heritabilities of the traits and the relationships between them. So the 4 traits of interest there being days to slaughter, carcass weight, carcass conformation, and fat class. And the data driving it, well, we've got some data coming from RAM Compare, because actually many of the maternal flocks involved in that project, the ewes are maternal breeds that feed into this analysis. But we've also got quite a lot of breeders that were collecting the data electronically anyway. And so when we asked for it, we're able to send us hundreds or even the odd 1,000 records through, particularly for the weather lambs that have been reared and then sold dead weight. So we've got some good phenotypes coming through. The next slide, Carrie-Anne. will show you that the accuracy levels at the moment will be lower. So by way of contrast, we've got the 8-week weight EBV here on the left, and you can see as progeny numbers increase, accuracies very, very quickly get up into the 80s and 90s because nearly all the lambs are being weighed. That isn't quite the case for days to slaughter. We've sort of got different groups here. Along the bottom would be rams with lots of progeny, but no or very little abattoir data. But along the top, even though it's early days, we're starting to pick up a band of current stock rams with relatively high accuracies for carcass traits. So we've got a good starting point to work from, and I know a number of breeders are quite interested in what this data is going to tell us and are committed to providing the data in the future. So a really useful trait, particularly as that data is effectively free, coming straight from breeders for use within our breeding programs. Next slide, please. The next presentation is going to talk about the other really interesting area, which is breeding for parasite resistance. So George is going to talk to us about that, and the new breeding values for that will be within the forthcoming evaluation. Next slide, please. So with all these new breeding values, we need to have another think about our breeding indexes, which obviously need to be updated to get new index weightings. And it's worth having a little bit of a think about who is the index for. Are we thinking about a breeding index that meets our needs as a pedigree breeder, keeping back female replacements? Is it about producing better looking rams for sale? Or is it thinking about the breeding objectives within the commercial flocks for our commercial customers? And in reality, all of those things are important. Thank you. So on the next slide, you can see that we're actually bringing three things together. First of all, we've got some linear weightings on the traits that are of economic interest. Again, I've used Clin as my example. I could have used any breed really, but we've still got quite a high weighting on 8-week weight, but a slightly lower weighting on scan weight. You can see on a weight adjusted basis, there's going to be much faster progress on muscling, and actually the animals are going to tend to be fatter as well. The previous weightings would have led to leaner animals at a fixed weight. This is going to counter that to quite a large extent. And you can see right at the end, your body condition score will also pick up as a result of that. We've got a good and positive weighting on number of lambs born and reared and maternal ability. Ewe mature size is expected to increase, but it won't increase as fast as it would have done under the old index. And in addition to that, I suspect some breeders are going to chase faster to put a cap on that particular trait, but it's a good starting point. Next slide, please. Now, in addition to those linear index weightings, we're also going to put a non-linear penalty either size of litter size born. So those breeding lines that constantly produce singles will pick up a bit of a penalty within the index. Those constantly producing triplets and quads, again, will pick up a penalty within the breeding index. And next slide, please. Those aren't numbers just picked out of the air. This chart actually shows as litter size EBV increases, you get a steady increase in the proportion of twins up to about 70%. And then beyond that, you're just ending up getting more triplet and quad bearing ewes. So the index weightings are taking that into account to try and optimize the sort of the twinning percentage within our populations. The next slide, Carrie-Anne, shows that in addition to all of that, we're going to put in a bit of a penalty on the biggest ewes within the population. So a penalty for ewe mature size that will probably impact about the top 10% of the Clin and Exlana within the evaluation, just to start the process of putting a bit of a cap on ewe mature size. And as I say, some breeders may want to go faster and further than that. So that's a bit about breeding indexes. Next slide, please. We're going to stick those together, and those will be the indexes that we use within our maternal breeding programs next season. And there'll be more information coming out to individual breeds over the next few weeks. Next slide, please. I've talked about breeding for economic performance, but if you actually click on the next slide, you will see that In addition to that, we're also breeding towards low methane sheep. You can see many of the characteristics that I've talked about, producing more meat and less fat. The really important one, which is getting lots of lambs sold over a ewe's reproductive lifetime, starting to place a restriction on mature size, and interestingly, in enhancing parasite resistance, will all help us towards breeding for low methane. There are obviously other traits that we can also build into our breeding programs, such as feed efficiency and measuring methane directly, but we shouldn't underestimate what we can achieve through these proxy traits. Next slide, please. It's quite nicely shown through this slide that I've pinched from Suzanne Rowe in last week's presentation, but they were looking in New Zealand at high and low methane producing lines, and you can already see the indirect selection that you're getting through those lines for slightly more moderate mature size, improved lamb survival, and interestingly, parasite resistance, which leads quite nicely into the next presentation. So next slide, please. So in summary, we're about to see some of our biggest changes to maternal breeding evaluations for 20 years. It's a fantastic opportunity. There have been some new traits that have been developed, and there's still more data collection to be done there, but we've got some robust breeding values to get us started. There's going to be a much greater focus on efficiency rather than purely output, and I think that's important in terms of the economic signals that that creates, and hopefully we'll get results out to you in January with all the latest information available through the Signet website. So just two quick adverts, Carrie-Anne. The next slide is just a reminder from my colleagues that not everything can be solved through genetics, as they like to remind me. Keeping on the maternal theme, Colostrum is Gold campaign will be kicking off in February. So that's a watch this space for more information about optimal use of Colostrum. And then the next slide, please, Carrie-Anne, is a reminder about the ballot that's coming up. So from an AHDB point of view, spring's going to be an extremely important time for us. Each of the sectors is going to be asking levy payers how it is that they want money to be spent from their levy in the future. And we're committed to having an open discussion around that, but it's really important that you get registered so that you can have your say, that you can be involved in that vote on how we spend the levy. If you just touch on the next slide, it's probably appropriate just for me to highlight within that context the impact that levy's had. I've talked about the impact over the last 50 years, but undoubtedly levy is a big driving force behind our genetic evaluations, as indeed it is in any other major sheep producing country. Only a relatively small proportion of the levy is spent on genetics, but we really eke it out to make the best use of the money because of the tremendous cost benefit that's returned to industry. And indeed, without that, many of the projects we're involved in would be relatively challenging. So there we go. So that was an overview from me. And I think that's my last slide.
Thank you very much, Sam. Thank you. And we've got time for a few. Oh, hold on. Something here.
Put the light bulb in.
Yeah, hold on. I've got to put a few quid in the meter. There we go.
Perfect.
That's better. Yeah, thanks, Sam. We've got time for any questions from anybody in the audience, any burning questions. But as I said, you can enter them in the question panel. I did forget to say at the beginning, this is being recorded and will appear on YouTube and on the AHDB website in the future. So if you've drifted off here or there, or you have had to go out and do anything particular, you can come back and see this in detail and go over it again at another stage. Have there been any specific questions, Emma?
Yeah, so Sam, should we have an EBV for bone percentage, since there is less variation in bone percentage within the carcass than either muscle and fat, and within that are muscle and fat therefore simply negatively correlated?
It's a really good question, probably one I need to have a think on. Got the phenotypes, so that's straightforward. It's just a question of what you actually want to do with that bone figure. Is it that I mean, in the broiler industry, obviously bone strength is extremely important, but I don't think we have those challenges in the sheep sector. And probably it's about reducing waste. that it may be of interest. But because the variation is relatively low, I think my main focus would be to put more effort on the muscling traits if we want to improve the the product quality that we're talking about. But if I think over it, maybe I'll come up with a different view tomorrow. But that's where I sit at the moment anyway.
Okay, so we might come back to you on that one. So
Absolutely.
where are we with customized indexes?
Really good question. We've developed on the Signet website the ability to create customized indexes. It's been a bit of a soft, slow launch because the time to update that is probably when I put the brand new genetic parameters in and we've got the new indexes. But next year, I intend to do quite a bit of work explaining to both terminal sire hill and maternal breeders how you can use customized indexes. So yeah, there's a really quite a neat little tool, and as much as anything else, it's a bit of a learning tool. You can say, oh well, I think I want to make 3 times more progress on muscling, so that's what I'm going to do, and you get results back that say, well, you can do that, but these are the consequences. This is what you'll actually miss out on if you do that. So that's quite useful, and particularly for things like mature size. If people want to go faster, then they can do that. The nice thing is this will tell them what the trade-off is.
Okay, so going back to the litter size side of things then, does the effect of twinning take into account the age of the ewe as she gets older and tends to have higher fertility?
Yeah, within our breeding evaluations, dam age is fitted as an environmental influence. So you would expect as the ewes get older for them to get more prolific, so we will adjust for that and take that into account. And that would be the same for a number of other traits. We often get ewe lambs lambing, which is really good for speeding up generation interval and turnover. Those lambs are probably the highest genetic merit, but also going to be the lightest. And that's exactly why we use BLUP, because BLUP, our statistical program, is able to tease out those 2 influences.
Okay, and then Mike, you'll have to tell me when you want me to stop, because otherwise I'll just keep going.
Well, 1927, so we've got another minute or 2, and then we need to move on. And I've got a question as well.
Okay, so how will body condition score be weighted in the index? Is there an intermediate optimum for that?
That's a good question. So initially it won't. We haven't got a weighting on it. It's a new trait. And quite often when you bring in a new research trait, it's good to just get it out there, get breeders to see the look and feel of it and to get used to using it. And then we can have the discussion about whether you need to give it a weighting in the index. Probably we need to see how it influences other traits in the background. So it's slightly early days, and at the moment it isn't weighted, although in theory you can do it through the customized indexes.
And just as a bit of a secondary to that, when are you collecting body condition scores?
You can provide the data, you can provide any data collected throughout the year. We will load all the body condition scores on, and then we go looking for the windows. So we recognize when the ewe was body condition scored, we see when she lambed, and we can determine was it a pre-mating weight or was it collected around weaning time. So the 3 windows are tupping, at the time when lambs are weighed for 8-week weighing, because very often the ewes are in front of us, although not so much for body condition scoring, and then at weaning, which is another time when people often do have their hands on the ewes. Okay,
I'll just do one really nice last one then before Mike has his, which is as a commercial breeder using EBV rams, is there a way to get my flock involved with Signet?
Yeah, I mean, it depends a little bit whether we're talking about purebred or crossbred ewes. We have a large number of people that use the service that have purebreds, so purebred Clins and Romneys and Easy Cares. As I say, I'm not worried about registered status from a breed society point of view. If they're purebred animals, it works really well and slots into what we're doing.
Okay, thank you, Emma. Thanks very much.
Okay.
There's not a question for you to answer right now, Sam, because we're getting some really great questions coming in. And as Emma said, we could have been here all night with those. There's one on genotyping. When are we going to get into genotyping? You can come back to that a bit later on. But interestingly, you said about we're moving towards efficiency. And it sounded a little bit like the statement coming out of the COP26, where we're phasing down coal rather than phasing it out. So my question to you is, the sheep industry moving towards efficiency rapidly, extremely rapidly, or at the speed of light? So you can come back to that one at the end of the session and address that one, okay?
Thank you, Michael.
All right, thank you very much, Sam. Thank you for that. Really, it generated a lot of good questions, so that was really good. And we're now moving on to our next speaker, George Cullimore. I'm trying to find the screen. There he is. George Cullimore is going to talk about breeding for parasite resistance, and hope you can make it all the way through, George. But over to you. Okay, thanks very much.
Oh, thanks, Mike. That's great. Yeah, it's not as much of a joke as you think. But I'm just recovering from COVID from last week, and very much this time yesterday. I wasn't sure if I'd be able to do this, so fingers crossed we'll get all the way through it. So I'm going to start talking about parasite resistance. So if we could have the next slide, please, Carrier. Thank you. So before we get started, I warn you, it can get quite complicated quite quickly. I'll try and take things slowly, but my brain, the way it is to this evening, even I'm having trouble getting my head around it all. Start off with, when I say we, what I'm referring to is the Performance Recorded Lleyn group, which I'm part of. I'm a breeder down in just outside Bath, and we've got about 25 members all over England and up into Scotland. And we formed in 2013. One of our main priorities as a group was to look at the options for breeding for parasite resistance. Why we wanted to prioritize looking at what we could do with the options for worm resistance really were fairly obvious at the time, because anthelmintic resistance, that's the worms themselves becoming resistant to the wormers that we're giving them, was a hot topic at the time, and still very much is, even though a lot of people are just sleepwalking into a crisis with that without taking it as seriously as maybe as they should do. So one of the ways of tackling it, as well as using the wormers that we've got as efficiently as we can, and looking at options with grazing management, one of the options is to breed ewes which themselves are resistant to the worms. Also, from economic point of view, just as well as just the gathering them and the cost of the wormers, it's reduced increased days to slaughter and reduced production efficiency. And going almost alongside that, welfare issues, obviously reduced growth, diarrhea, and obviously death if it's not treated or found a way of managing it. And then more of a hot topic at the moment, the environmental impacts. There's a good study done by SRUC a couple of years ago, which showed that per kilogram of dry matter, parasite infected lambs could produce 33% more methane emissions. And if you then combine that with the reduced production efficiency and the increased days to slaughter, it could be a major driver of the greenhouse gas emissions reduced during lamb production. So if we can get on top of that, we could be a major contribution to getting our lamb production to be less detrimental to the environment. So if we have a look at the next slide, please. So if we look at the start of the worm-resistant journey, we've always known that some sheep are more genetically resistant to worms than others, but the tricky bit is just trying to identify them. The work started way before we started looking at with the collection of individual fecal egg counts. So that's, for those not used to this sort of thing, we literally just collect a poo sample from each individual lamb, and then, much as you would with a normal mob sample, have that analysed to see the number of worms there, and use that as a ranking to then create an EBV for your lambs then. These benefits are obviously greatest in maternal breeds, where it can, as well as being shown in the lambs and then in the ewes and rams that we're using. It's been around for 20 odd years, but in this country, but uptake rates, with just a couple of exceptions, have been fairly low. But in more recent years, Lleyn group and the Ixlanas as well have taken over 20,000 of these samples between us, and the cost shared between a subsidy from AHDB, who've helped us out all the way through this, and funding from the farmers as well. That's an investment of over £100,000 over the last few years. If we have the next slide, please. These fecal egg counts can present quite a few challenges in terms of using them in breeding evaluations. The heritabilities have been fairly low, and actually they've always pinged around a lot with each different evaluation. Each time we've looked at it, they've been higher than this, and they've also dipped much lower than this. There can be issues with poor repeatability. We'll talk a bit more about that later on. There's areas where inaccuracies can be built into the system, which actually can make it harder to make much progress. We're never sure if we're actually taking a proper account of the age at which they're sampled. There's also issues with actually which worm species are present, what eggs we're actually counting, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. On a practical level, there can be quite a variation in the moisture content of the samples we try and collect them. Not to be too graphic about it, obviously lambs that we've taken up to higher worm counts, if they're experiencing diarrhea, for example, it can be really quite difficult just getting it in a sample bag. So we could be missing out some of those ones that we really need those samples from, who are poor at worm resistance and are just being recorded as a no count or as a low count because of the consistency of the feces. And there's also issues with actually in the counting process itself, where sampling errors can creep in quite easily when they're counted in the liquid suspension. So if we're just going to have a little look at this differences in the species that there may be within the fecal egg counts as well. So if we could have the next slide, please. So we're aware that there was variation of the species within the samples, but weren't quite sure to what extent it was. So in 2017, AHDB funded a small study taking mob samples from 13 flocks from Llyn and Romneys. And the only way to really see what species there is to then pay for those to be hatched, which was some work carried out at Glasgow University. And the results on the next slide, please. So there's quite a lot going on this slide. So if we just have a look at it slowly, there, obviously all the 13 flocks are down the left-hand side there. And if we go along to the column along the top marked T circumcincta, that's Telodosargia circumcincta, which is the most parasitic of the stronggar species that we have. And I think we kind of assumed that samples between sheep and between farms probably contained fairly similar mixes of the different species, but actually when we looked at this, the percentage of these each individual species within each sample, as we can see, varied a huge amount. We look at the top of the flock at the top, where 62% are of this more parasitic Telodosargia circumcincta, and then down at the bottom, this can drop down to as low as 19%. So although it's only a small study, it's hard to draw too many conclusions. I think we've always known that individual effects are not as are probably different, and they need to a little more analysis than we thought. We assumed that they were probably a little more similar than this. The variation was quite a bit bigger than we thought, and could account for sometimes why at similar mob sample levels you're seeing quite different performance in the lambs. So it could be that it's the percentage of these Telodosargia circumcincta which are causing more problems, because there's a higher percentage on an individual farm. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So when our group decided to try and have a look and see what options there were for us when we were trying to get a handle on all of this, we could have looked at DAG score, though that's not something that's ever really been analysed very much in the UK. It's a very cheap measure to do, but as we know, when we're looking to drench worms, just because they're mucky behind certainly isn't always because of a high worm burden. We've obviously got the option of fecal egg counts that we've been talking about, but with all the potential issues that we've looked at, and this is over the years has resulted in fairly poor industry uptake. Something that's often put farmers off is that the lambs have to be under quite a high worm burden to get meaningful results, and farmers either found this difficult or not been prepared to put their lambs under that much pressure. If we wanted to get a real true measure of the parasitism within the sheep, we could actually have a look in the stomach and see what was going on and count up the worms that were there. But clearly this means killing the sheep and doing individual dissection work, which is incredibly expensive and is not really suitable for breeding programs, because once we've done that, we can't breed from the sheep. But that would give us that true level of resistance if we could look into the stomachs and see what was going on. Also, while we were looking at the time, there was a new test being developed by researchers at Glasgow University. So we just click again, and this was a test to actually look at the actual immune response itself from the sheep. So within the stomach of the sheep, they mount an immune response, and one of those responses can be measured in IgA, which is immunoglobulin A, which actually shows their response to worm infection, and actually specifically to this most parasitic of the strongyles, the Telodystagia circumcincta, which is completely what we're after. So this looked like quite a good option for us at the time. It's quite easy just to take a saliva sample, which you can take yourself just with a dental swab. The only potential pitfalls were that it wasn't really a tested approach, and we weren't quite sure how it was going to go, but we thought it could give us a really good indication of what the level of parasitism was in individual sheep, and the higher levels of the IgA would suggest that those lambs are mounting a much better immune response. The IgA in the saliva was hoped to be a good indicator of the IgA in the actual mucus of the stomach itself. So if we have the next slide, please. So that was where we started in 2014. We were given a grant by AHDB. In fact, I think it was EBLEX at the time, a farmer innovation grant, to start looking at collecting these saliva samples. A picture of me doing it on the right hand side there, just whizzing around with these dental swabs, a fairly easy process. They were processed then by the academics we were working with at Glasgow University. But once we were collecting these samples, unfortunately we realised that it may have been a slightly false dawn, as the predicted heritabilities didn't really materialise. It was giving us a heritability of about 11%. So not ridiculously low, but and I know in maternal breeds we're quite often used to working with fairly low heritability traits, but a lot of those are almost like a free hit, where we can extract the information without doing much more recording. But with a trait like this, it's actually quite an expensive thing to pay for the analysis, and if we can try and sell it to farmers, we really need to have a higher heritability to attract them to spend the money, so they can see that they can make progress fairly quickly. We felt there could be issues with the repeatability of the tests, and we were wondering if it was down to the dilution rate of saliva, and whether we should have been adopting some better protocols around fasting or non-fasting before samples were taken, which is something they've done with horses with a similar test, though much more easy to do that with horses, which is on an individual basis, than with a barn full of sheep. So we weren't quite sure where to take it from here. So at the same time, the academic we've been working with moved to start working abroad, and we were thinking, right, where do we take it from here? So we then dived back into the published literature ourselves to see what our best options were. So if we can have the next slide, please. So this was a study done over 5 years, 5 seasons of Scottish blackface lambs, which showed that the relationship really well between measurements for the levels of IgA and reduced worm burden. So showing that the lambs with higher levels of IgA we're showing greater resistance to worms. But as the eagle-eyed of you amongst you will notice that I've highlighted in red, this was actually in blood plasma rather than in saliva. If we have the next slide, please. And so we dug around further in literature and found that there was quite a lot of evidence showing that the IgA in that mucus in the stomach, that there was quite a good correlation between that and what was found in blood, but much less so than what had been shown in the saliva that we've been working with initially. And you have the next slide, please. Similarly, there were other papers like this dealing with other breeds of sheep in different countries. This was with sheep in Spain. And again, they were showing the relationship that we wanted to see between the IgA activity and increased worm resistance. But again, they've been looking at this in blood, in this time in blood serum, rather than in saliva. So if we have the next slide, please. Next slide, carry on. Can I have the next slide, please? Carry on, are you there?
I am. My apologies. I think there's just a bit of a delay. It just froze on my end. I'm not sure if that was someone else. There you go. My apologies.
I thought I was talking to myself for a minute. Thank you.
Sorry, it just froze for a second there. So please continue.
That's brilliant. Cheers. So if we go back at our table of options now, we replaced the salivary IgA one. If we just click on the next bit, carry on. Hopefully a box will pop up in a minute, hopefully, if we just give it another click. Where, yeah, so we've wondered if it would be the best plan to replace the saliva IgA with serum IgA, because all the research that we could find showing that this is probably the best way forward have been based on blood rather than serum. Obviously, the disadvantage is it was going to be more expensive for breeders, as either they were going to have to collect the blood samples themselves if they've been trained to, or have to pay a vet to do that. But we felt that if the information we get more valuable, breeders could probably justify this. So if we have the next slide, please. And around this time, the Clim flock at Harper Adams joined our group as well. And probably more importantly than that, so did Kate Phillips, who was a lecturer at Harper Adams, and is an independent sheep consultant. She came along with the Harper flock, which was fantastic. That was the best result of all. And having discussed it with her, we came up with the idea of a project at Harper Adams where we could look at all the options that were available to us. And Kate applied for a European Innovation Partnership grant, along with help again from AHDB for us, where we could look really intensely at these options and see what might be the best way forward. It was quite a big project, but one of the major bits of it was the comparisons that we could do with FEC, saliva IgA and serum IgA by doing intensive repeated testing of 84 lambs at Harper, looking at repeatability and the robustness of the EBVs that we already had, trying to come up with what would be the most effective breeding program, and see if we could just check that we're using the right sort of protocols as well, and if we could switch to just using one of the tests. Right, if I could just have the next slide, please. So here's some of the results of that those tests. So there's quite a lot going on here. So if we just take it slowly, maybe with the first line. So on the first day of the tests, we took repeated samples of fecal egg counts, so individual fecal egg counts. We took one followed by a small gap and then took another for just a repeated sample. And those, each time we tested them, that we could come up with a ranking of the individual lambs in that, which is obviously what we need for constructing the EBVs. And then we compared that with the duplicate samples. And there was some correlation between them with the spearman rank coefficient there. If it was a perfect correlation, that would be give you a value of a 1. And as you can see on that first day for the duplicate effect samples, we're getting a value of 0.45, which is showing there is definitely some correlation, although it's fairly weak. And similarly then for saliva IgA, we did duplicate samples on the first day. And again, it showed that there was a correlation there, though maybe not as strong as we would have liked. And so if we move down again, then on day 3, did the same, took both fecal egg samples and saliva samples again. And those examples there show us the correlation with the samples taken on day 1. So there is a correlation, albeit a weakening one. And then the results sampled in red, circled in red there, those are showing us the ones for the serum IgA. So day 1 versus day 3 gives us an extremely high correlation there. I mean, that's a similar sort of result as if we'd run them over the scales twice, something like that. It's fantastic for this type of test. And then the lambs were wormed on day 3, so we can no longer fecal egg count them as we clear the worms out, but we continue taking serum samples. So we had to wait for the levels to come back up a bit, but we then retested them on day 31 and day 38. And again, with these quite large gaps, we're seeing really good correlations again using the serum IgA. So if we could just have the next slide, please. So from these results, we're able to conclude that we are seeing that the repeatability of the duplicate samples for both fecal and saliva were quite variable. Ranking of individuals by fecal shows some consistency, but yet was relatively weak. But serum was showing a lot of consistency, and that was highly significant. And this led us to think that serum IgA should probably be the route that we go down now, and in assessing our worm resistance. So have the next slide, please. So off the back of those results, last year AHDB funded a one-off project, which, as Sam has hinted, has actually been a two-off project because we've repeated it again this year, where we took a lot of blood serum samples, and a subset of those we also took fecal egg counts. And at this stage we were joined also by the Ixlana breeders. I'm sure most of you are familiar with them. They're a wool shedding composite, and luckily we got samples, enough samples from both breeds that we were able to analyze them separately, so it was quite good to get the results from 2 separate populations. And fantastic result that we got from this was the heritabilities were as high as we had hoped. For the Ixlanas, it came out as 39%, and for the clean flocks at 36%, which was fantastic, if anything better than we could have possibly hoped for. Pleasingly for the Ixlanas, this was nicely correlated with the fecal egg counts. Unfortunately, we didn't see this as clearly with the clean flocks. I mean, there's not massively a massive surprise as we're measuring like different things as we've seen, but I think if we can sort out different protocols with that, and we've been talking to the Ixlana breeders and see a few differences there, I think we'll see that come around. Once the sets were combined, we came up with thank you, a heritability of 32% for the nearly 4,000 samples taken, and we're hoping to repeat this sort of number this year. In fact, I think we're very nearly there this year. Right, over the next slide now, please. Having lots of results has always meant giving Sam a chance to pull out some very pretty graphs, which he's done for us here, showing the variation in the serum results for the clean flocks, and seeing if there's anything that we can pull out of that. The initial research had shown that we're probably best sampling in September, October time, and that maybe shows here, although it would be great when we've got a few more years data to properly have a look at it, that variation may be dropping as the season goes on. So if we can maybe tighten up that protocol and get as many of them done September, October, that might help us. Or it could just be that there's a lower challenge there. But even so, the sort of thing we'll be able to look at further when we have more years to look at it. If we have the next slide, please. And here, although there's relatively few samples either side, it shows us that the big good variation that we saw in the year 2020 there, and we only had a few results in for this year for 21. Also worth pointing out that my own flock is the one in light green there, so it was quite satisfying that I had the highest sample in the ewe lambs last year. And some also like to point out that I sold the ewe, but it's always the case with all these evaluations that we're not looking at these traits individually, and although she really ticked the box here, she wasn't necessarily the greatest on all the other traits that we look at, so she hasn't actually continued in my own flock. If we move on to the next slide then, please. And here we look at this time this is with the Ixlana rams, and looking at the relationship there between serum IgA and the fecal egg counts, and we're confident that we'll see this relationship strengthen as time goes on. We're starting to see good correlation there between higher serum IgA, which is what we're looking for. The higher levels with IgA shows a good response, and low effect levels. So we're always looking for high positive serum IgA and low, if we can, negative FEC results. Move on to the next slide, please. And here again, this is looking at some high, average, and bottom 15% rams here. These are actually 3 from my own flock here. And obviously, it's very early to try and draw too many conclusions here, but it's looking promising that between the sires, performance of their progeny here is reflected in the EBVs of the rams themselves, which gives us a fair bit of hope there that we're on the right track. We have the next slide, please, and the next bit. Brilliant. So we've come a long way, but we need to just look at where we need to go next. As breeders will carry on looking at these traits, but if we had as much support as possible from the wider industry, we could certainly move a lot faster. We realised that we need to test a lot more sheep. It'd be great if we could tissue sample, at the very least to store it, and hopefully working towards looking at some genomic solutions in the future. So I'm sure Professor Coffey will be very pleased to hear. But what we could do is just building up a big database of DNA so we can get started with that. And obviously it'd be great if we could then get a really reliable phenotype that we could then use genomics so we could get values for untested sheep, an accurate value for untested sheep. It would be fantastic. Always great for traits like this, which are quite expensive to look at. Be good if we could just check that we are using the right sampling protocols. As we were talking about with IgA, just checking we're doing things at the right time of year. And I think particularly maybe for the clean flocks, to check that we're exposing our lambs to high enough pressure when we're doing fecal egg counts. It'd be great if we could look at the impact on breeding females when they lamb. So if we could take some measurements before and after lambing to see if the IgA results that they were showing as lambs are carried on when they're breeding ewes. We did actually have plans to do that, but we couldn't carry that out last year because of COVID. So it'd be great if at sometime in the future we could look at that. It'd be great if we could really look at the effect of selection on different lines of high and low EBV lines. It's hard to have a metric just to measure this against. It's hard. We're obviously looking at FEC. We're just testing one test with another, so it'd be good to actually look to see what effect this is having on the true level of parasitism, which could only really be done by maybe some trial matings and then some dissections on ram lambs that aren't required for breeding. So we could just check that things are moving in the right direction when we are looking for this IgA response. Be good to have a think about the wider impact of selecting for immunity. There's some quite interesting work going on in Australia at the moment where they're looking at the overall effect. I think they call it immune competence. I think they call it, where they have looked at the immune response to cattle when they've been given a vaccine, and then looking at that as a proxy measurement for an overall generalized response to infection. And it'd be good to see if there are any conclusions we could draw from that from our work here. And as our confidence grows with the rams that we are selecting, it'd be good to develop some marketing strategies for those. I think it's also important to say that we need to make sure that we're giving enough samples to the lab that we're working with at the moment. We've been very lucky that BioBest have taken this on as a commercial test now that they're offering to us. And Rebecca there in particular has been fantastic in moving this up. When we could no longer do it at Glasgow, it moved to Morden, and then the people at BioBest then took it on for us, and so it's now available as a fully commercial test through them. And it's incredibly important that we can try and retain that through them. So if we have the next slide, please. So I think hopefully we've seen that we've come a long way. It's hard to believe now that adverts like this were in the farming press even when I wasn't even that young, but I think we've realised that that's not the way forward, and that certainly as breeders there's a lot more we can be doing to push things forward, to make sure that we're in a good place for the future. We've only got this far because of enthusiastic breeders, but all the way backed up with Levy support, and everyone at AHDB has always been fantastic. Obviously, Sam in particular, Emma, Ed, Bridget, everyone's helped us all through this journey. I'm sure you'll appreciate having just had this little snapshot that it's complicated, but really feel that we have made progress, and that we're on the verge of having a really important new tool that we can use with confidence to help in one of our biggest challenges as an industry. But we are going to need continued support if we're going to carry on with this. And finally, I'd like to just make sure we thank everybody who's helped us get this far. So our academic partners, and obviously AHDB and the funding bodies, and BioBest who are helping us do the testing now. Right, thanks, Mike.
Great, thanks very much, George. Excellent talk. I'm glad you managed to make it all the way through.
That's nice. Can't say I feel 100%, but no, that's great. Yes.
Very well done. I can see quite a lot of questions have come in, Emma. So do you want to give us a few? We've got a few minutes to get George some questions before the next talk.
Be gentle with me.
And if you've got a drink, George, you've got time for a quick drink.
Oh, please.
So the first one then, could we select these resistant individuals just from their performance while facing infection? And is it the do-gooders that we see that are the resistant ones? Can we select them that way?
It would be fantastic if it was that simple, but it's not really. If you want to do that on farm, you really need to put them under pressure. And then when we've done individual fecal egg counts, we see that even ones that appear to be doing very well are chucking out can be chucking out loads of eggs and causing all sorts of infection problems for the rest of the flock. And also, even these ones might be fine at a certain level, but they may well be a threshold level that they reach when they're not all right. So much better if we can to actually look at the immune response and select those responders. Be a much more efficient way of doing it.
Okay. And do you know if ewes resistant to worms on one farm have the same resistance to worms on a different farm?
I mean, that's another advantage of the IgA, because we're targeting that specific species that's giving problems everywhere, as particularly in the late summer, early autumn, and so yeah, say that with much more confidence with IGA than we can with fecal egg counts, in my opinion, because for all the issues we looked at the beginning, where we see that there can be a massive variation in the actual species you've got there on different farms.
Okay, and then I'll just put this one in as a last one then. I hadn't thought about it before. Is there any concern that the parasites will adapt to the worm-resistant ewes and overtake genetic selection for resistance?
It is a good question, and it's one that I have had myself, and I've put to the academics, and I've luckily had great assurance that actually that won't be the case.
Okay, and the only other thing I will add is a message from Bridget, which says, "Well done, great effort despite feeling so rough. You can relax and sleep well tonight."
Thank you, I definitely will.
Thank you again, George, and thanks, Emma, for the questioning. It's a great talk, and actually lends itself extremely well to a genomic solution, I'd say. Now you've got a decent phenotype. Next step is genomic breeding values for these things.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, George. And we're now going to move on to our next and final speaker, Sharon McIntyre from New Zealand, beef and lamb genetics in New Zealand. And she's going to talk about enhancing maternal performance. So I don't want to take up any of your time, Sharon, so away you go. It's over to you.
Thank you, Mike, and it's a pleasure to be here and speaking to fellow farmers in the UK. So next slide, please. So that I've just a brief outline. I was asked to speak about enhancing maternal performance, and we have some key maternal traits: reproduction, survival, maternal, and weaning weight maternal, which I'll come to. I've got another small section on our focus on health and welfare traits, and a short section on a progeny test we've been running for a few years, looking at reducing inputs. And can you click again, please? There's a little time delay, so I probably need to factor that in. So as breeders, everyone's trying to breed the perfect sheep, you know, one that's good at all the traits that we need it to be in, and it's smart and intelligent and easy to look after. Fortunately, I think we never get there, so we continue striving, but also what the perfect sheep is very different in different environments and different farm systems. So just to set the scene a little bit, our maternal flocks in New Zealand are very Romney based, which would be historical coming from the UK. And even our composite and some of our breeds we've established certainly have a Romney base. The average flock size for our maternal breeds adds around 500 to 600 lambs a year, but some of them are very big, and we even have one that's over 7,000 lambs a year. So we have a base year of 1995, and all our values are relative to that. Our key maternal index consists of reproduction, which you call litter size, but we call number of lambs born, so it's the same thing. Survival, lamb growth, there's a penalty on adult size, and we currently have wool in that index, but with the recent market conditions, we're moving wool out. We have a weekly single-step integration of genotypes and measurements done. We have a number of sub-indexes, so you can have the core maternal index, and then you can add on the things that may be important to you. So you can add on meat, you can add on DAGs, you can add on parasite resistance, and they all add together. Next, please. And then next again. So reproduction, it's a very low heritability trait, but with the power of computers, you can actually make very good progress. So we now have an extra 14% lambs born per every 100 ewes since 1995. That's the average of all our flocks, and I expect it's a wee bit like the UK. We have some people that make very rapid progress, we have people that make very steady progress, and we have people that make little or no progress. So that's the average value, but some have done a lot higher. Some are now having sires that are in excess of 50 to 80% of the 1995 average, which means we have 2-year-old ewes with triplets and quads, and these are causing some issues with ewe survival and lamb survival. Next. Previously, we had the system where an extra lamb was always given the same reward, but we know as farmers that changing from a single to a twin is an advantage, but changing from a twin to a triplet or a quad is less of an advantage, and the value of those extra lambs is less. Next. So we've fitted a non-linear index similar to what Sam was talking about, but our non-linear index, it starts to reduce the value of an extra lamb, and then it caps it at a value, whereas what Sam was talking about was there was again a greater penalty at very high number of lambs born. So this is the approach we've done so far, and it's been in place since 2017. Next, please. So the other key trait for maternal sheep is survival, because we lamb, 99% of sheep are lambed outdoors. So this is a challenge for our sheep. So we have an extra 14 lambs per 100 ewes on average, which means more multiples, so a greater survival challenge. Next, please. So there's genes that the lamb has that affects its, back, please. There's genes that the lamb has to enhance its survival, things like the brown fat turning on and keeping its body temperature up and the drive to drink. But there are also things that the ewe does that increases her lamb's survival. Things like finding a sheltered spot, the bonding, the colostrum being present at birth. And so far we've got a gain of 1% in that. So even though we're getting more multiples born, we've had a 3% gain in lamb survival per 100 lambs born. We've also had some filters put in place that have been very helpful. Some rams may have been mated to a very small number of ewes, say 4. So we have 4 pregnancies, and chance may mean that 100% of those lambs survive. Or if one of those ewes dies or there's a very difficult birth, we can easily swap to 50% of its lambs survive. So we have filters that remove those very small data sets, progeny groups, and when we have very extreme levels of survival, which can't be real. Next, please. So weaning weight is another aspect that has a maternal component to it. So there's the genes that the lamb has to grow, and there's the genes that the ewe has to feed that lamb to weaning. Next, please. So in progress since 1995, we've got nearly a 3 kilo increase in the lamb direct genes and about 1.5 in the milking ability of the ewes. This is important as we get more multiples born. Next. This is a picture of it's actually a wether if you look very closely. It's probably someone's pet lamb, but very large ewes is certainly an issue for handling and shearing and the number of stock per hectare. We have it set up as a linear trait. I actually quite like what Sam was showing earlier on, but we have a standard penalty for every extra kilogram of ewe weight. In some of our more challenging environments, it's not well liked by breeders because they sometimes struggle to get good adult weights, whereas where we have the kinder environments, we can get some very large sheep. The growth of an animal is fairly set. It starts off, an animal that grows rapidly when it's young will generally turn into a larger adult. So trying to find those curve benders is difficult. Next. If we keep selecting for fast-growing young animals, we will get larger sheep. So the penalty we have in place at the moment reduces the rate at which the ewe size increases, but it doesn't stop it. So on average, we've had an increase of 5.2 kilos in live weight at 8 months and a 3.3 kg increase in ewe weight. So next, please. Next, there we go. So body condition score, this is a trait that our farmers have taken up with enthusiasm, with about 1/3 of our maternal flocks now measuring it. You can measure it at multiple times of the year, scanning, lambing and weaning, but most are recording it at pre-mating. And also we take our ewe live weight at pre-mating, although you can take them at other times. So we've had a very modest improvement in body condition score to date, but that's an overall average and not all flocks are recording it. We also, when we muscle scan our young animals, we use that as an early predictor of body condition score because we take a fat depth when we do it. Next, please. So DAGs, I'm not sure what your UK farmers are like, but there's not a sheep farmer in New Zealand that has any love for DAGs. So we consider DAGs as independent of parasite resistance. It's often a lot to do with how sensitive an animal's gut is to changes in feed or the consistency of the fecal matter they produce. But it's cheap and easy to record, and we do make some small progress in it. We've estimated a heritability of about 30%. So we've made small gains, but there's certainly progress to be made in this trait. Next, please. So parasite resistance, I really enjoyed George's talk. This has been around for quite some time in New Zealand, but there was really only a dedicated group of about 40 breeders that were making any real progress in it. And we've had a big increase in numbers of breeders in recent years, I think, as the pressure has come on from commercial farmers. And now about 28% of our maternal flocks are recording FEC. FEC seems to have worked very well in New Zealand in sheep. It seems to be quite consistent across different environments, and progress has been made. There's a little bit of Kala in sheep, which I don't think George touched on. So Kala is an antigen in the saliva to the protective sheath of the larvae that they ingest. And this antigen binds to that protective sheath, and it makes it hard for the parasite to locate the infection site in the sheep. So there's a little bit of Kala in sheep, but it has been very popular in our deer herds. I also work in deer genetics, and almost all our venison-focused deer herds now record Kala at 6 or 10 months of age. FEC doesn't work very well in deer, and as you can imagine, getting your samples isn't something people are that keen to do. So of our flocks, we now have a 5% reduction in eggs per gram for the 2020 born lambs on average, but that reflects that a lot of flocks have come on in the last 5 years and are still in that early stages of making progress. Our best sires are now have FECs of 50 to 60% reduction. Other breeders take a different approach, and they do what one of your questions earlier was about, that if you withhold drenches for a period and see which animals keep growing well, we tend to think of that as resilience, and some of those animals can be putting out very large numbers of parasite eggs for their contemporaries, and some have less. So it is one way of selecting for animals that are less impacted, but it doesn't do anything about the contamination on your farm. Our FEC protocol was quite tight. Animals have to be at 800 eggs per gram before we sample them for our breeding values. Next, please. So facial eczema, I'm not sure if you'll be familiar with this, but this is a fungal toxin that produces spores that are highly toxic to sheep. They metabolize it through their liver, and it causes considerable liver damage, and that liver damage can lead to photosensitivity. It impacts heavily on their productivity, and they can either die at the time or later on when, say, a lambing stress comes on. It's a problem under warm and humid conditions in the North Island, but with climate change, the prediction is that this will become a more important disease for us. Fortunately, it also has quite a high heritability at about 40%. And some flocks that have been breeding for resilience for a long time now have minimal to no harm even in a bad sporidesmin season. It's a very expensive test. We're looking at about $400 per animal sampled. So it's an area where genomics has the ability to spread that cost over a greater number of animals. But even with genomics, you have to have phenotypes. Someone has to record those phenotypes, and you can spread the value greater, but how you fund that in a fair and equitable way is also a bit of a conversation that we have. Next, please. So longevity, this is something Sam did ask me to talk about, and it's something that I did my master's study on. So one of the things I learnt through that is that the expensive part of longevity is rearing those young stock. So those two little lambs at the bottom, every time we rear a replacement, that means we're carrying, you know, a less ewe on our farm. So that's where the cost lies. We'd like sheep to have multiple lambings before exiting the flock as an aged ewe. But we do know that some ewes leave early. Some may only have one lambing, 2 or 3, and these are the really expensive ewes. These are the ones where you've incurred the rearing cost and you haven't had those multiple lambings for the payback. To me, my thinking changed a lot while I did my project, that it's not about having 6 and 7 and 8-year-old ewes in your flock. It's about stopping 2, 3 and 4-year-olds leaving. So we have a stayability BV, which is stayability to 5 years of age. The data also showed that if you stay to 5, you're highly likely to stay to 6. So it's at an age where we can get quite good information without having to wait a very long time. Because by the time a ewe is 5, her sire is 7, and it's a long time since you bred those animals. There are different reasons that ewes can leave stud flocks, and we have what we call commercial or unsound ewes. So these either die, or they have low scanning, or they fail to rear their lambs. These are the sorts of things that commercial farmers would cull on. And these incur a penalty for stayability. But then we have what we call knowledge culls. This is where a breeder may say, I don't need any more of that line, or these animals have low indexes or breeding values and I'm going to cull them and retain other ones. So these are perfectly sound sheep. So in a commercial situation, they would be retained. So we have no penalty for knowledge culls, and there are always some where we don't know why they left. We can record exit fates in great detail, teeth, feet, pregnancy, all sorts of things, but it is poorly recorded by farmers. We have some flocks where the ewes mostly leave due to deaths unsound and aged, and the stayability breeding value works well for them. We have some other flocks where a ewe may have 2 lambings and the breeder thinks I've got everything I need from her, and he either culls her or transfers her to his commercial flock. So a sound ewe leaving. And where you have that sort of situation, a ewe that has a 3rd or a 4th lambing ends up getting a really big BV because, wow, she's still here at 4 and 5 and 60% of the other ewes are gone. So it doesn't work well in those flocks, and it makes it hard for it to be a breeding value that you can use across flocks because the policies differ so much. Next. Next. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about a low progeny test flock that we have going on. So this has been going 2 years now, and it's where some breeders got together and said, you know, there's so much work with dags and tailing and drench resistance and all sorts of things. Can we set up a flock where we look at maybe reducing the interventions by the farmer? So this is a Romney Hill flock, and we use 17 sires from industry by natural mating and AI, and we recorded all the usual traits, growth and meat and reproduction. But we also looked at doing a few things differently. So the males have been untailed, and last year they were uncrutched. They were DAG scored twice and they've been FEC tested, and they had to be pushed quite hard to get to our level of 800 eggs per gram before our sampling. The females were tailed because they're retained. They had a weaning drench and a pre-winter drench, but the males only had the one weaning drench before slaughter. They were FEC tested, and we also used some new science looking at methane and residual feed intake. And also when they retain to the age, we get some pregnancy scanning and lambing data on them. Next. So one of the things we did at tailing was we're looking at what is the length of the tail, and this is done with a ruler, and also we look at the length of the bare skin under the tail. So all these ewes are Romneys, which all have long tails, so we're looking purely at a sire effect here. Our shortest tail was 13 centimetres and our longest 31, and the bare skin under the tail was 2 centimetres and 18 centimetres. We do actually have research breeding values for tail length and tail skin, but when we get a bigger data set, we will re-estimate the heritabilities. But tail length is, being one of the skeletal traits, has a very high heritability. Next. So we also did quite a lot of work with parasite resistance. Some of the rams were from flocks that had been breeding for resistance and some that haven't. We had to push the sheep quite hard to get to our 800 eggs per gram, and that is something that has been a problem with people taking up FEC testing because it can be quite hard on the sheep. This definitely reduced growth rates at times, but we used paddocks of red clover to boost growths when they were not doing so well. And we managed to get the males right through to slaughter at reasonable weights and good times with the use of red clover pastures at times. Next, please. So the other thing we looked at was dagginess. So these males here have long tails and they are uncrutched and unshorn. So they certainly had the ability to accumulate large quantities of dags. I think our heaviest crop of dags was 4 kilos. So we had to factor that into our live weight. But even given this challenge, our 3 best sires had 90% of their progeny with a 0 to 1 score. So virtually no dags. Our worst 3 sires only had 7 to 10% of their progeny with a 0 to 1 score. But this meant that even the very worst sires, who had large numbers of very heavily dagged animals, still produced some sires where they were relatively clean. Next, please. So then we looked at what is the performance of these ewe lambs by assessing them with teaser rams with coloured crayons on them. So we didn't actually mate them, but we did record when they were marked and how many marked they had. So these teaser rams were with them for 45 days, and 3 sires had less than 50% of their ewe lambs marked, and 2 sires had 90% plus marked. We call it hogget lambing or yearling lambing. I think you use, is it shearling, when I was talking to Sam. The interesting thing was that they were all very similar scanning percentages as two-tooth. So the approach that what happens at a young age is independent of what happens later on. So next slide. So of those ewe lambs, from those 17 sires, 10 ewe lambs went into the residual feed intake at facility at AgResearch. These ewes had a 12-day period where they accustomed to the new feed, which was a lucerne pellet, and then they had a 42-day period where they were measured, weighed and growed, and everything was recorded about how much they ate. So next, please. The interesting thing with this is that we have 7 animals here, 7 ewe lambs. They have a very similar weight at around 40 to 50 kilos. They were all growing at around the same amount per day, but the intake that they ate per day varied quite a lot. We actually had 2 sheep there that ate nearly 300 grams a day less than the average, and a couple of sheep in red there that ate considerably more to do the same amount of growth at the same body weight. So we don't have residual feed intake breeding values, and it's not built into our program as such, but it is an interesting area of study. And again, it's about that efficiency of production. Next, please. Those same 10 ewes from the 17 sires were then put through a mobile packed chamber where we could measure their methane and their carbon dioxide output. So these are 17 industry sires from flocks that haven't done any work in methane, so pretty much just an unselected sample of sires. And you can see here, this is the grams per day of those 10 progeny for these 17 sires. So red shows that some were emitting a lot more methane, and blue was emitting less methane per day. So there is certainly scope to do some work in this area. Next, please. So this low input trial has had a huge following by commercial farmers, and with COVID we've had some online seminars about it, and there's been a large number of commercial farmers on there, and from that they've been going to their breeders and saying, we want you to record parasite resistance, where we want to have less DAGs, and it's been quite a motivator for our breeders to pick up those new traits, knowing that there's a demand for them. So when Sam was talking too about increasing productivity is positive for methane, and I'd have to agree completely with that if we can increase the productivity and efficiency of our sheep on a farm systems approach, that reduces our methane work. So I think New Zealand used to have 46 million sheep, and we now have 26 million, and we produce almost the same amount of lamb meat. So there is potential for big gains, but as your production gets up there, it gets harder to do. So New Zealand's a wee bit different in that most of our methane emissions come from agriculture, nearly half of all our emissions. So there's quite a big push by government for farmers to reduce their methane emissions. So we've been a lot of work for 10 years by Dr. Suzanne Rowe at Ag Research, and they used packed chambers, and they've developed this mobile trailer which can be taken around our breeders' flocks, backed into their yards. Sheep are on pasture. They need to be on really good pasture levels, run into here one by one into a wee chamber. They're measured in that chamber for about an hour, and then they go back to pasture. And we do about 15 progeny per sire. To date, we've had about 27,000 animals measured, and the variation is about plus or minus 1.5% methane per kilogram dry matter eaten. Also looking at genotyping all these animals so that we can spread the value to related animals. The aim is to have about 1,000 key industries sires measured. If we can prove to the government that we can reduce our methane measurements, then we potentially have a lower liability in methane taxation. Next, please. So we've come up with a very similar heritability to growth in meat, meaning that we can make reasonable progress. The research lines that they had established at Ag Research and have been breeding the highest to the highest and the lowest to the lowest have diverged by about 12% methane per kilogram of dry matter eaten, and that's only 3 generations. So over that 10-11 years, it's quite a significant reduction. The work they've also been doing has shown that if you put methane into the index, we can make about 80 to 90% of the progress in our other traits at the same time as reducing methane production. So because agriculture is such a significant proportion of New Zealand's greenhouse gas emissions, there is going to be a lot of pressure on us as farmers, and we are going to have greenhouse gas tax liabilities to pay. Just quite how that works out as yet, we don't know, but potentially we're looking at setting up a program that we can roll out across New Zealand to try and reduce that liability. Next. Oops, we've missed a slide. So one of the things I'd like to just mention about the methane, it must have dropped off, or it might be an additional one I did later, is that they're also looking at measuring other traits. Putting animals through those packed chambers and taking it from farm to farm is obviously quite a slow and laborious way of measuring animals. So they've been taking rumen samples and milk samples from sheep, and what they've found is that the rumen samples, the volatile fatty acids that are being given off in the rumen and the profiles of the fatty acids we're seeing in the milk give us an indication of these high and low animals. So it may be that we can have a mixture of tests. So if it's just taking a milk sample from ewes, or whether it's a rumen sample where you put a tube down and take a sample and get those analysed, that would be a much lower cost than putting animals through these chambers. So, you know, this is a space where we're watching with interest, because it would be good in other animals. We're putting large numbers of cattle through packed chambers, or deer through these chambers is quite problematic. And it may be that we can have these other measures that can help us identify high and low emitters. So that's a bit of a snapshot of maternals and some of the things that are going on in New Zealand, and I'm really happy to answer any of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Fantastic talk there, and hopefully we'll solicit some questions. We'll take some questions specifically for Sharon first. I think, Emma, if you've got some there.
Yes, there's some really nice ones about the tail length and skin under the tail length, Sharon. So the first one, is a short tail better than a long tail, and do you want more or less bare skin, and why?
Well, the thought is that tailing may be one of those things that is prohibited in future. So a short tail means, you know, we may be able to not tail our sheep. So that's where that one's come from. Oh, excuse me, someone's at the door.
Oh no.
Are you still here, or have you gone?
I think she's gone to answer.
She's gone.
Yeah. Must be important. It could be a lottery winner.
Sorry. Someone always comes to the door, doesn't it?
Was it the postman?
No, someone looking for another farmer. So tail length. So yes, we'd like short tails, so we don't have to tail, and also the short tails seem to be a more triangular shape, and the sheep tends to lift it up when defecating, so we get less dags. And the bare skin under the tail, the thought is that less wool there for dags to adhere to, so it may be involved in less dags as well.
And just another one kind of on the back of that, is tail length linked to spine length at all? So a very short tail might result in a short sheep with less high valuable cuts.
Well, that's a really good question, and I don't know the answer. Pass. It's a research brevet at the moment, so we're building this database, and as soon as we get sort of large amounts of records, we can start looking for those sorts of things. But in the meantime, we're just starting to record it. But it's a very good question.
And then just moving on to feed intakes a bit and having a look at that. Residual feed intake testing is highly valuable, but does the feed not need to be more closely associated to the actual feed the animal eats in the paddock? So as an example, lucerne pellets would require a smaller rumen, whereas a high pasture intake requires a larger rumen.
Yeah, another good question. The practicality means it needed to be a something that was similar to grass. So there was work done where they cut grass and they brought the grass in, but that's obviously quite problematic and difficult. I do know with the methane research, they they had animals in pack chambers, and they were feeding them nuts, and they were feeding them lucerne pellets, and they've also done the grass. And it was very consistent between the lucerne pellets and the pasture-fed animals that were high and low methane on the lucerne pellets were high and low on pasture, and they did that several times. So I'm hopeful that the lucerne pellet is a good proxy for pasture, but I not being the scientist, I can't answer with great confidence.
Okay. And then looking at the FEC and parasite side of things then, I think you must have made a reference to the top flocks reducing FEC by 50 or 60%. How are they doing that? Is that purely through breeding?
Yes, so one of the things I noticed in Sam's slide was they're talking about marketing. So we have worm FEC Gold, and this is people that have been breeding for quite a long time and have larger number of animals in the top 20% for parasite resistance. And so what you find in these breeding things was there was that group of 35 or 40 people that were very passionate about this and put a lot of emphasis on it and made quite rapid progress. And those people have got some of those rams with that high resistance. There was also some science work where they took rams that were bred in one environment for resistance and moved them to another where the parasite species were different, and they found it very, very transferable. So slightly different experiences to what George had, but our protocol was also very specific, so maybe that helps. But yeah, we've seen a greater number of breeders come on board in recent years, I think partly as a response to demand from our commercial farmers, and they're only just beginning that journey of selection.
Okay. And then there's a question here, what is the ideal body condition score breeding value?
Well, a body condition score just ranks animals relative to each other rather than being an actual number in itself. So the body condition score thing came out of our sheep have increasingly been pushed into harsher environments because of the takeover by dairy. And in those harsher environments, we can experience more cold issues or drought issues. And we want animals to be more resilient. And obviously fat is an important buffer for a ewe. So I suppose it depends with a body condition score. It's built into the index, so there's a reward. But for the body condition score, if you're wanting to increase it, then you would just choose animals with or sires with higher BVs and animals with lower. So I was interested in the approach about the question was, is there an optimum body condition score? And there could well be, but I think that is when it matures a wee bit. Once we start getting to the issue of having overfat sheep, then I think we may have to address those sorts of things again. But at the moment, it's just seen as a positive that ewes that are higher body condition score at one period of the year tend to be higher, or 85% correlated with being high at other periods, and that does infer some robustness in tough conditions.
Okay, and I'll just have this as the last one, Mike, if that's okay. With the pelleted lucerne, was there any concerns or problems with lack of long fibre in the diet and subsequent rumen damage?
No, the animals gained 10 kilos over their time in the crates, and this is in the middle of winter, and they were growing at 334 grams a day, so the sheep themselves were doing very well. We didn't see any health issues at all. It was interesting that some of our very parasite resistant lambs from a parasite resistant sire, they were very slow to get onto the feed, and there's been some talk that parasite resistant animals are very particular about their grazing pattern, that they won't graze near animal poop, that where the concentration of larvae can be high, and that they have some of their resistance actually comes from their grazing pattern. So I'm not sure how well proved that is, but there's certainly been observations around that, and our highest FEC ewe lambs in there were very slow to get onto the feed. But no issues I'm aware of about fibre, but it was for a 14-day conditioning period and then a 42-day feeding period.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Emma. I'm just answering questions there. Right. Okay. So I think, I mean, we've had a great set of presentations there, and I think some overlapping issues. I think, and one of the things I'd like to think a little bit about, and perhaps solicit some commentary on, is the fact that historically, and being an academic, usually we would end up these sessions by saying more research is required. We need to know a bit more about methane emissions, a bit more about feed intake, a bit more about IgA and worm resistance and the like. And then when we know a lot more about these things, Sam can put it together in an index and we can select for it. And if we're not interested in selection, well, we can perhaps do it a bit in a few years' time when the kids come home from university or whatever else it is. But it strikes me that, COP26 finished the other day, that we don't have the luxury of being able to know more than enough to be able to do something. So my question to all the kind of panelists really is and to the people observing is, how do we affect the kind of change that's required using the tools we've heard about tonight? What's stopping us doing something at the speed of light rather than at some sedentary 10 or 20 year program of selection for these traits? What's stopping us, Sam?
Well, I guess it will come down to economic drivers. They often say, well, farmers aren't always fast to change. Actually, farmers are very fast to change if it makes a financial impact on them. I remember certain breeds coming in and very quickly replacing the breeds that had been there because there was an extra couple of pounds a lamb in it. Now, the challenge with some of these traits is, where do we see that direct economic driver? It was really nice hearing about the Parasite work, and Sharon specifically said commercial customers are asking for it, so the ram breeders are doing it twice, 3 times as fast as ever, and to keep ahead of the other competition. That's obviously the clear challenge with the methane story, is to whether it's going to be the carrot to embrace the change or potentially the stick coming in. And I can also see it's going to be interesting. There's even suggestions that government may introduce that change in both New Zealand and maybe the UK, or it may well be through the supply chains, quite vocal on red meat and where it's sourced and the story behind that from an environmental point of view. And again, it would strike me that supply chains are a good medium to pass the economic signals along. So yeah, farmers will respond, both the breeders and the commercial producers, but the commercial producers need to be asking for it, and they'll ask for it when there's a real clear economic signal.
Yeah. And Sharon, is that signal obvious in New Zealand?
Yes. So 25% of farmers need to know their greenhouse gas emission number by the end of December this year, and 100% need to know their number by the end of next year. And there's talk of what they're going to set the taxation rate at, and it's pretty scary actually. It's going to make farming quite a challenge. We're seeing a lot of forestry and carbon farming come in, but at the end of the day, there's large areas, of hill country where the only practical way of making food on it is by putting it through a ruminant. So we're looking at maybe some government assistance where we may be able to roll out methane work faster, by some support of genomic testing and extra testing. And the estimate is that there'll be a bit of a lag, but we could potentially reduce methane by half a percent a year genetically. So we're still going to need other things, whether it's these vaccines or feed treatments, or whether we can prove efficiency. But you have to be careful with things like the feed efficiency, and that if you have sheep that eat less, you just run more, don't you? So maybe your total emissions aren't much changed.
Yeah. I mean, it's not a very simple and straightforward thing. I don't know if George is still with us or not, but clearly part of the efficiency metric, as it were, is wastage. Oh, right, here he is. Yeah, is wastage. Waste practices. If we waste animals' productivity by worm burdens, if we slaughter them at an old age, leave them too long, and so on. Surely, George, some of these things are so critical that we really ought to be investing everything in them.
Yeah, and I think it's amazing what we've achieved with relatively little money, mainly from AHDB, and we could push this so much quicker. We've just been lucky that we've had so much enthusiasm for people looking at this, but in some ways it seems remarkable that we're not having money chucked at us to take this as far as we possibly can. So I think really the story with us is what we have done with so little.
No, interesting. I noticed a couple of comments come up in the questions about support payments, carrot or stick. One of the things is to withdraw support payments so that the industry is left on its own, a la perhaps that was a thing that happened in New Zealand. Sounds like taxation, that's a very big stick. But I'm kind of intrigued to know what is it that we can do for ourselves before the stick is wielded. And I think George, tickled on it a little bit there. Is with a little bit, a lot of enthusiasm, you can do an awful lot. So what else is going on? What else is going on?
Well, one of the things that concerns me is if we do these efficiency things, shorter days to kill and more lambs, will the taxation system recognise those or not, or will it be just a blunt? Every lamb that goes to slaughter is a fixed taxation per head, in which case a lot of these things that you might try to do to make yourself more efficient and reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, there may not be a system that recognises that and rewards you for it.
Yeah, good point. I guess though the reverse of that though is going to be that if you don't do anything, whatever they bring in is going to be a troublesome to the sheep industry.
Yeah, you're right. And I suppose the other thing, sorry, just thinking back to another of Sharon's slides, was all about the sizes and the numbers involved. Now we can achieve that, but we have to achieve it through working together. The big spikes on that Dorset chart right at the front was when people started working together. George has only achieved what he's done because he started working with a big group of breeders. Even that wasn't enough, so they started working with another whole breed. And now we're producing analyses that are mixed breed on that very basis. So there's a lot that can be done, but you do need to keep as a group to get the critical mass to go even faster and to roll out the benefits even faster. So people will invest in you if they can see the industry impact that you have, rather than just being a small subset of individuals with a great idea.
Yeah, I could see Owen Gray there. Should there be a push to more payments to lambs with less days to slaughter? That's being discussed in beef as well, because clearly the longer longer a ruminant is ruminating, the more greenhouse gases it produces. So the quicker it can go for slaughter, pro rata, it's far more efficient. I think Janet Roden there said, how do we get the bottom half into the top half? I did tweet about this the other day, and not everybody got my joke. When I said we need more farmers in the top 10%. But I mean, the gist is we want to be pushing the bottom up because then, they push the top up further. And I guess the question to everybody is, how do you go about speeding it up?
Yeah, I mean, the sheep breed survey might just a simple stat showing half the producers still aren't using estimated breeding values. And the major reason for that was lack of access. They didn't have them available, they couldn't find them, and a big chunk still not fully understanding them. You can say, gosh, Sam, you've been doing this 20 years, they should get it by now, but it still showed after all the time that actually we've got a huge potential that isn't being exploited. It's not about the new trait that doesn't exist, exciting as they are, but that we've got a chunk of people that aren't using the technology. We've always said when there's a harder economic line, that will come, and they've been slightly blunted from it until now. And we are seeing change. I don't want to be negative, but it's been a little while coming.
Yeah, it's taken a while to move this massive rock, this boulder, pushing it uphill, as it were. But intriguingly, all of the things that are left for us to now address, which all relate to greenhouse gas emissions, resource use efficiency, disease, the use of antibiotics, the use of anthelmintics, every single one of those traits lend themselves extremely well to genomic selection. So maybe I'll just chuck it out there. Maybe the future is about nucleus flocks, breeding companies, and genomic breeding values. Can you see that happening, George?
I hope not. I think there's still going to be a place, I hope, for individual breeders or breeders grouped together. I think, yeah, I mean, you can obviously see how progress could move quicker like that, but it's whether the UK is really ready for that sort of structure. I'm not really sure. I don't think so. I think, yeah, we've shown with our example how you can push things forward, just with a more loose banding of individual breeders determined to make progress in an area. So I wouldn't discount that straight away.
Sure. What do you think, Sam? Do you think there's a role for more breeding companies to start taking over sheep breeding?
Well, there's an inevitability about genomics.
Yeah.
Partly because, and if we'd been talking about this 10 years ago, we've said we don't quite know what to do with it. We've got lots of questions about how to use this, and yet up in Edinburgh, you know exactly what to do with it, how to turn the numbers around. You can tell us how much longer that will take to turn the evaluation around, and what it will mean. So we know exactly what to do with it. It's just the challenge of how we fund that. And because the really interesting thing for me is, how do you balance the cost of genomics? If I have a pot of money, let's say the ballot goes through and people say, well, we'd like to spend more on genetics. The next question will be, well, how do we balance genomic solutions versus progeny testing? A lot of people have read about the low input progeny test in New Zealand and got very, very excited. Why aren't we doing that? And it'll be interesting just to talk about the balance between all of those options. But yeah, definitely genomics is an inevitable part of our future. And I think anyone involved in pedigree production should be putting the genotypes away now for their stock rams, or at least putting the tissue behind the peas in the freezer, so that we're storing that information. And it's just when we get to that tipping point, and what you tend to refer to as the disruptive technology of suddenly one group moves, and so others have to do that to follow suit.
How's it? Yeah. And Sharon, are you seeing genomics playing a bigger role in New Zealand?
Yes, so our maternal evaluation has about 100,000 genotypes in it, and we're in the process of standing up a terminal evaluation because we have some meat-eating quality traits like shear force and intramuscular fat, where genomics is a really key element of taking those measured phenotypes and spreading it further. That has its own issues. It looks as though we can't have terminal and maternal genotypes in the same evaluation. So currently we do have one evaluation, so it looks like it will split it. I think the big lesson for New Zealand breeders and people has been that even with genomics, the phenotype measures are still critical. You need both because over time things change, and you need to take those expensive traits but get better value by being able to spread them over more animals with genomics.
I think what you're trying to say, Sharon, is hashtag phenotype is king, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. I thought you were struggling for the words, but
I timed him at 1 hour and 58 minutes for those of you that were playing bingo at home to see when he would say it.
He got it in the chat before then, Sam.
That was longer than I thought. Oh, did he? Oh, okay.
Yeah. But I think that that really does kind of summarize it, doesn't it? It brings it round to the fact that historically we've had the luxury of being able to think about how long things are going to take and how do we get things to happen and who's coming for the ride. I think somebody, John Martin, has put a really great comment about where the biggest bangs per buck are going to come from. And it looks in the sheep industry, be like getting the poor farmers to do something average rather than trying to push the very best farmers even further. I mean, the very best farmers are more likely to become even better, and the very worst farmers are unlikely to become better. But I have to say, certainly my feeling is that we have lost the luxury of time and the sheep industry and the beef industry to the same extent have now got to be bold and radical. And I'll give each of you a minute to tell us what you think the next bold radical steps are going to be. We'll start with you, Sharon.
Oh, no time. I think if we're going to make bold and radical steps, then we have to think about how we can use advanced reproductive technologies to find those really elite animals and use them widely through AI and through embryo transfer, animals that have those hugely superior traits. And that is difficult because, you know, breeders have their own programs. But if we want to make very large gains, we have to take some bold steps.
Right, good. George, what do you reckon?
I'm cross because Sharon's just stolen mine, because before I did anything about worms, my specialist area, my dissertation was on sheep AI, and that's always been the problem of the uptake in this country. Has always been so low, and that there's still, you know, I was writing it over 30 years ago now, they could see the massive potential for it, and it's still there, and it's still not really any massive numbers being realized. Obviously, you see a bit in the terminal size, but there's hardly anything in the maternals at all. So yeah, I was. You should have asked me first, Mike. But yeah, just back that up. Yeah.
Okay, good. So we've got some bold steps. We've got advanced reproductive technologies in females. Similar to genomic selection, what you're trying to do is accelerate the exploitation of the very best females as well as the very best males. So ultimately, your answer, Sam, what do you reckon? How do you think we can solve this?
Well, I will just agree with them, but for a different reason, because we haven't touched on the uncomfortable truth is connectedness between flocks, which would be another hour's discussion. And I'm going to take genomics as a given, so that's not I'm not voting for that. I get that as a free vote. So I suppose if we're being bold about the future, we have to ask about the new livestock database that's being created. I'm very interested about the collation of data. We've seen what you've done with HCC and AHDB in terms of the beef carcass traits project. That's a database that will have a tremendous amount of data in it. And we've seen in other countries where you've managed to bring those data sets together, the power of use of those effectively free phenotypes in our evaluation. So I am excited about some of the new things we can measure, but I'm always excited about free data that can be very valuable as well.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's great. I think we've had a good discussion. Unless there are any, Emma, I don't know where Emma's gone, but unless there are any outstanding questions that need sorting. Anything, Emma?
I was going to say, can you put that slide on the screen?
Okay. Yeah. I was going to, unless there are any questions, I was going to round off by, first of all, thanking all the speakers for an excellent session. Really good. You know, it came together nicely. It was almost like it was planned. You know, there was 3 really good talks that really overlapped well and really reinforced and you know, did a good job together collectively. I'm very pleased by the fact that we had 140 odd attendees at one point, which is really good turnout. And I thank all the people that have put questions in there. As I say, those questions will be retained, and I'm pretty sure each of the speakers will get the opportunity to review them and answer any of them that they can. There's 1 or 2 in there that I thought myself and Sam will get back to. And then finally, I'd like to say, if you've enjoyed this, look on your screen, there are some other sessions. And at the end of this, you'll get asked to fill out a little survey form, which is just something for AHDB to enable them to ensure that future webinars and online events are orchestrated in the way that finds the maximum amount of enjoyment from the viewers and listeners. So with that, I think we should all go off and enjoy what remains of the evening. I'm going to hoist that dog out the door, take her for a little walk. She's a diva of a dog and she loves the attention, so I'll get and walk her around the block, Thank you everybody again for your attention, and have a good evening. Goodbye.
Thank you.